Patrol reports have just come in that the Germans are moving towards a strategically important farmhouse in the centre of the village just ahead. So it's time to assemble the platoon, get the Bren guns ready and advance. Today on Dragon's Teeth we're playing Chain of Command. Thanks for joining me, and yes, today we return to World War II. You may know, if you're a regular on the channel, that World War II was my first main era in gaming back in the 70s. We used Airfix kits mostly, and Esky and Matchbox and that kind of stuff as they came out. And the rules we used for quite a few years for 20mm or 25mm were the War Games Research Group, Armour and Infantry, 1925 to 1950. This is the 1976 edition, so a venerable rule set, and we had a lot of good games with that rule set, I remember. Later on, when we scaled things up in terms of battle size, we moved to 1/300th, but I've always had a soft spot for that sort of 25mm small action, a platoon or two, a few AFVs on each side, that kind of scale battle. So when Dave said he was going to be running a Chain of Command game at Bedford Gladiators, I signed straight up. Chain of Command is a rule set by two fat lardies who I'm sure are very well known to you. They put out a ton of other games, Sharp Practice, What a Tanker, What a Cowboy, Infamy, a whole load of stuff. And I think it's fair to say they've got a very large following on the war game scene. I'd never played any of their games before, so I was interested to see how these rules worked out. It's a World War II skirmish game set at platoon level, so you're starting with about 30 figures aside, and there is scope to add in vehicles and AFVs as well, which I'll mention as we go through. Dave explained the rules were quite new to him as well, so he ran the game. I took the British side and Roger took the German side. We advanced on that farmhouse in the centre of the village. Let's see what happened. Chain of Command, here's our rulebook, a conventional size rulebook, nicely designed, all clearly laid out. And here's our table with the farmhouse that became the focal point of the battle. And we're playing on a new mat here, one of a pair that the club recently bought. Can't remember the name of the manufacturer off the top of my head, but yeah, it's a very nice looking mat. There's that farmhouse that was the focal point of the game. So the rest of the layout is basic sort of Normandy countryside. It's an infantry battle, so David tried to put in a fair amount of cover, but of course we do have some fields and open areas as well as those woods. Now you may notice there's no figures on the table. This is because Chain of Command has a very unique opening. It starts with something called a patrol phase. Here's the British platoon, standard platoon size, 3 rifle squads, each with a Bren gun, and also a Piat team and a 2-inch mortar team, and the 2 command figures in the middle there. The Germans have the equivalent, it's a Wehrmacht platoon. Rather than Brens, they've got MG42s, of course. They don't get a mortar, they do have a Panzerfaust as one of their fire teams. So as I mentioned, we start with this patrol phase, and in fact this becomes like a little game within a game, because this is going to determine where your forces come onto the board. So the idea is your units are pushing out patrols in advance. You have a rough idea of where the enemy is, and you place these markers. You get a certain amount of markers, and you start to move them from your baseline 12 inches. They have to stay within a certain distance of each other. And you take it in turns to place these and move them. And basically when they get within a certain distance of each other, then they are locked down. In effect, they can't move anymore. So I guess this represents moving forward until you just get contact with the enemy and your scouts aren't advancing beyond that point. So here we see the British markers being placed down, and there we've got They're within range of that German marker, so they are both locked down. There's still some German markers being moved. Once we get into a situation where everything is pretty much locked down, we go into the jump off point phase. So what happens now is we have some more counters, and these will represent where our troops will actually be deployed on the board. And again, there are certain rules here about distances. They have to be both from friendly units and enemy units. So a little bit of measuring going on there between the Brits and the Germans. And I think you have to be sort of about 6 inches back from your jump off marker, and your unit has to deploy into cover as well. We can see there we've got the German units behind that hedge. And Roger had another unit quite advanced, quite out in front. But because they're in a field there, that jump off point had to be moved right back to the edge of the field, to that sort of hedge line. So sometimes, even though you might have your patrols pushed out in front, it doesn't mean you can deploy in that position. So from there we get into the actual start of the game, and each side gets a certain number of dice to roll, depending on their unit type and morale and so on. The Brits get 5. Now, the number that you roll means you can activate or deploy certain things. So 1 is a fire team, 2 is a section, 3 is a junior leader, 4 is a senior leader, 5 you get something on your command dice, which I'll talk about later. A 6, if you roll 1 6, doesn't really do anything. 2 6s in effect gives you an extra turn. So here's the Brits deploying from that jump off point. Again, you go a certain distance from that point. Another thing with this is you can have your figures put into, I think it was tactical stance. So these guys are going to be in a field, but they're kneeling down. So in effect, that doubles the value of their cover and makes them a lot harder to spot. So that's a nice touch as well. I got quite a good roll on that first move there, so I was able to deploy most of my sections. There's the other section is in the woods there. Now when you deploy you can't move, but you can fire on that initial turn. But there's no targets as yet. And putting the troops in this wood, I thought would be good. Obviously they're starting off in cover. In a way, as we'll see later on though, it sort of pinned them down. And other than putting out some fire, they didn't really do much in the battle. Roger had a bit less luck on his first dice roll, but he managed to get a section out here, which is the MG42 fire team, and also his riflemen, who are very close to the farmhouse. So that MG42 team did a good job in keeping my chaps pinned down, and the riflemen were able to very quickly get into that farmhouse. So this became, as I said, one of the focal points really for the battle. You can see we've got that German section there, and you've got the plucky Brits tucked away in that field, and I've got another section out behind them as well, and there's also a 2-inch mortar team just tucked in those woods there. And there's another German section deployed just behind that hedge there. So we get into the next turn, the Brits roll. Now when you activate your officers or leaders, a junior officer gets 2 actions and a senior gets 3. So that means they can issue 2 orders, or they can issue an order and move. There's a variety of things you can do. So this is where you start having to make decisions about using your actions, using what resources you have. So one action was to order the Brengun team to move into cover behind that wall there. The green counter denotes that they're in that tactical stance I mentioned earlier. So they're crouching down behind the wall, and the rest of the section are moving up towards the farmhouse. When you move, by the way, you do it on a D6. I think the normal move is 2d6. You can fire with that, or you can rush or charge, which gives you 3d6 of movement, but you can't fire. Second section is moving up in support. They're going to be going for the side of the farmhouse, which was going to lead to not a good result. And the third section are just moving up to the edge of that forest. They've got a nice field of fire there across the open ground to the road beyond. On their turn, the German section make it to the farmhouse. I think they have to spend a phase getting in through the door, but in effect they're into the farmhouse on turn 2. And we have the first shots fired from that MG42 team and their riflemen firing on the Bren team opposite. And you roll the dice. I think the MG42 has 8 dice and the rifle gives it an extra 1. And the results can be anything from a miss to a shock to a kill. So the shock is nice, you could put a little marker there. And of course the more shock you start accruing, the more negative the impact on the unit's performance. And Roger did roll 2 6s on this turn, so in effect he got the extra go, which meant more fire on the Bren gunners. They took more shock, no casualties, but still in shock. And that rifle squad moved into the house and took up firing positions at the windows. And his second section started moving along that hedge. They were able to get a nice flanking attack in, as we'll see later, because they're covered by the hedge. Then later they moved into dead ground on the other side of it. So very sneaky. So now this back and forth develops between the Bren and the MG42 teams. And the Brits are definitely getting the worst of it. I had the feeling of them being pinned down really by this MG42 fire. They managed to get a shot or two back, but really they're not doing so well. And of course this is giving that other section the chance to move up on the flank there. And the Brits got so fed up with this, they decided that number 2 section was going to charge down the road, a big move down the road, and in effect outflank that MG42 team while keeping the cover of that wall there. At least that was the plan. Because of course the observant among you will notice that the Germans have only deployed 2 sections, and lo and behold, Roger got the dice roll and he's able to deploy his 3rd section right across the road there, meaning he catches my number 2 section right out in the open and is going to open fire with a full squad, including the MG42. So he rolls a whole load of dice now. He gets 5 hits, so I make 5 saves. Number 2 section ends up taking casualties and also of course shock as well. So basically they've been brought up short in their tracks and now they're out in the open with a section ahead and an MG42 off to the side. Not good. Here's that other German section moving down the flank now. I don't know if you can really see it on the picture there, but there's a ridge, there's a slope on that field, and they're using the far side of the slope for cover, so they can't be seen by the Brits. We've got a firefight going on between the section behind the wall and the Germans in the house. Nothing too conclusive going on there. A bit of shock on each side, but no real casualties to speak of. The Bren gunner is the only man left from his team under that withering MG42 fire. He takes so much shock he's forced to retreat. Now shock can be regained by having a leader attached to the individual or unit, but of course that uses up a certain amount of that leader's action points. So again, this is where you have to start making decisions. One bonus for the Brits with the German deployment of that section in the road is they're now in the field of fire of the section in the woods there, and effectively the Germans are in the open, so they start taking casualties from that fire and also from the 2-inch mortar behind the farmhouse that opens up. So they're taking casualties and shock as well, and now it's their turn to be a bit sort of caught out in the open. In the meantime, my shot up second section have fallen back to regroup under cover as best they can, try and get rid of some of that shock, and we've still got that ongoing firefight in the farmhouse there. I guess because both units are in good cover, there's not really a lot of casualties being taken there, so it's still pretty indecisive. Meanwhile, my junior leader, the platoon NCO, is moving over to attach to the Bren gunner, our shaken Bren gunner, and he's going to spend a turn or two knocking off some of those shock points, hopefully getting that Bren gun back in action. The mortar team are still firing on that German section out in the open, not with huge effect, but it seems to be as much a psychological effect as anything, still giving them some shock, which is, all helps. And of course they are still under fire from my section in the woods. But this is where I say about this section getting pinned down, because they're in such a safe place. The Germans are having trouble shooting back because they're difficult to spot in the woods. And they've got a real nice secure firing position. If they move out of that, they've got to cover all that open ground in front of them, as you can see here. So in effect they were quite happy to stay there and take pot shots at that German section, but they're not really achieving anything else. So while it's a good firing position, it's not really achieving anything else. It's keeping that section away from the main fight which is going on at the farmhouse, and they've got to cover a lot of open ground if they're going to get across there. On his next turn, Roger rolled a couple of 5s on his command dice roll. Now every time you roll a 5, you move your chain of command dice round one. When it reaches 6, you get the option to do something a little bit different. So some of the examples are here. You can interrupt your opponent's turn, you can end a turn, you can relocate a sniper, you can spring an ambush, a few different things that you can try there. So that was something he now had up his sleeve. With that Bren gun neutralised, he also gets the chance to advance his MG42 team. So now potentially they're in a position to open fire on my section in front of the farmhouse there. And Roger also got the opportunity to move that squad out in the open. He got the chance to move those back into cover. Again, they're returning fire on my section in the woods. So I suppose you could say that my section there are keeping that German section pinned. But I still think they could have done something more. And of course he still has that other section as well who are using that dead ground and that cover to sneak up on the Brits' left flank. So they're working into quite a nice position. My shaky number 2 section moves back across to support number 1 section. They're taking cover in that field now. The Bren gunner is getting his nerve back, so he'll hopefully be back in action in a moment. And we've still got that stalemate at the farmhouse there. This is the British morale table. I started on 11, but obviously with those losses I've taken, I've dropped down to 9. And this is where that German section who are in the dead ground, they now creep up onto the crest of that ridge, which of course puts them in a great position to fire down into the flank of the Brits below. So at this stage it's starting to look very tenuous for the British. They've got one section a bit damaged there, one very damaged section, and that other section over in the woods who are untouched actually, but too far away to really do anything. When they open fire, the Germans cause some casualties on that section, and also that red marker there, that denotes that the British section has been pinned. So that's really it for the British. I conceded at that point. We could have maybe got another round in, but there's nothing the British are going to do there to improve that situation. So we'll retreat with dignity. So thank you to Roger, a well-deserved win there I think, and a big thanks as well to David for organising the game. There we are then, a victory for the Germans. That's our first game of Chain of Command. I hope that gives you a flavour of the rules. As I mentioned, we were keeping things pretty simple and pretty straightforward just to get into the game mechanics. We all enjoyed the game is the first thing and want to play it again, so that's always a good sign. I think, as I mentioned, my natural aversion to this initiative system was allayed in this because, yeah, there is a sort of initiative system, so you might not be able to do exactly what you want, but I thought this worked it very well in terms of you have to deal with what you've got and the situation as it unfolds. It's a little bit like resource management, and in some aspects that put me in mind of Starfleet battles, where of course although you allocate all your energy at the beginning of the turn, the situation during the phases can change and you have to really think on the spot. So that aspect of it I really liked, and as we all said, David pointed out in particular, it felt like it was forcing us to act in the way a squad leader would, making tactical and strategic decisions based exactly on what was going on at that moment. So that was a strong point of the game, I thought. It felt very balanced. Either side could have won. You know, maybe if it wasn't for my charge down the middle, things might have turned out different. But that again felt realistic. I made the charge, the Germans popped up out of nowhere, and I paid the price. And I also like the fact that the setup at the start, you have your platoon. You don't have a point system where you can build your own platoon. You know, I might decide to have 15 SMGs and 3 snipers and whatever it is that adds up to my point value, but that's not how platoons were made up. So you have an actual platoon, and then if you're playing with those extra points, you can add in your support stuff, which again feels realistic. Now, there might be arguments that, of course, during the war, platoons might be at different strengths and everything else, but I'm sure you can factor that in some way as well. The rulebook was reasonably clear. We managed to solve most issues or any questions that arose quite easily. There were one or two things that took a little bit of pondering and working out, but we got there. And overall, once we got into the mechanics of the game, it started to flow quicker and quicker. I think we were playing for about 3 hours. That was with consulting the rules quite a lot, and we didn't quite finish. I mean, it was obvious that the British were on the downturn, but you know, we could have gone on for another turn or two maybe. But I reckon you get a good 3 hour platoon level game out of this. In terms of negatives, nothing major popped up. I mean, in the game we were playing in that scenario, no complaints really. I do wonder how this would work with the patrol system and the jumping off points if you had a force attacking a sort of defensive position or a dug-in position. Would the defenders be deployed automatically at the start? I'm not sure how that would work, but certainly for this sort of encounter game, then it's a perfect system. The other thing I wonder is if you can have more than 2 players on. I guess if it's platoon level, you're playing the platoon leader in effect. So I'm not sure if you had 2 platoons aside or if you were having some sort of mix of more than 1 player. I'm not sure how that would work. That'd be something that would be interesting to look at. Overall, though, this felt like a good simulation of a platoon level action, and I say that as a person with no direct military experience, so take that for what it's worth. But as a game, it felt right. It felt balanced. The things that happened felt logical, and you were forced to make decisions that maybe you hadn't quite foreseen. And sometimes, as we know, no plan survives contact with the enemy. But there we go. That's the fortunes of war. So yeah, we all really enjoyed that. We're going to be playing it again. I'll let you know how it develops. Next time we'll probably add in some vehicles and some other bits and pieces. So it'd be interesting to see how that works out as well. Alright, so that's it for today. If you do play Chain of Command, please let me know how you get on with it. Any major mistakes that you saw me made there, apart from tactical ones, please do let me know. And I'd be interested to hear if you've expanded the game out, how you get on with using AFVs and all the other elements as well. As always, please do keep your questions and comments coming in. Always good to hear from you. And I'll see you next time.